Throughout history, there have been many great military leaders, but their achievements are dwarfed by those of one Macedonian king, Alexander the Great, the most successful commander of the ancient world. But at the age of 32, he died under mysterious circumstances. Was it disease or murder? Over 2,000 years later, experts are reopening the case. As we unearth the ancient secrets of Alexander the Great, can science finally reveal the truth? The life and death of Alexander the Great has become the stuff of legend. By 26, he had carved out an empire stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan. But in the 13th year of his reign, at the age of 32, he fell sick and died. Ever since, generation after generation of scholars have failed to discover what caused the death of Alexander at such a young age. Now modern science will attempt to succeed where history has failed. Former Commander John Grieve was one of Scotland Yard's most successful detectives. As head of the anti-terrorist squad, he helped stem the tide of IRA bombings in Great Britain. He has cracked hundreds of modern murder cases, from gangland killings to sinister poisonings. Now Grieve will use all his experience and expertise to try to get to the truth about Alexander's demise.
Alexander dies at the age of 32, at the height of his power and fame. He's about to embark on another expedition of theft and violence, and there is a cast of suspects who have never been resolved in circumstances that nobody truly understands. What could be more suspicious than that?
Although little is known about Alexander's death, the events leading up to it are well documented. In order to crack the case, Grieve will have to re-examine the existing evidence. Minute by minute, he'll analyze Alexander's final days. In 323 BC, Alexander was at the height of his power. From his base in the captured city of Babylon, he now plans to attack Arabia. His most ambitious plan yet, the capture of Arabia would be a key milestone in his relentless campaign to expand his empire. Just days before the planned invasion, Alexander is drinking heavily with friends at a banquet. Late that night, he is taken ill. After 12 days of sickness, at the age of 32, Alexander dies. He left behind one of the biggest mysteries of all time. Who or what killed the greatest commander of the ancient world?
He was a Macedonian king. Macedonian kings just don't lie down and die in their sleep.
Was it disease?
West Nile fever fits in with the diagnosis like a hand in a glove.
Or murder?
I can bring a toxicology angle to the story that hasn't been considered before. And I believe he was poisoned.
For Grieve, this very cold case needs a closer look.
The death of Alexander is a deeply suspicious death.
And to identify a possible cause of death, Grieve calls in a team of medical and forensics experts from around the world. Between them, they'll use the very latest scientific techniques to try to uncover the truth. And they'll perform an unusual experiment to recreate Alexander's documented medical condition and monitor his symptoms closely. But Grieve has one final analytical method which he hopes will help him find out what happened to Alexander. On every case, he builds a complex matrix of thoughts, connections, and visual references known as a mind map. It may appear unconventional, but it's a technique that has made him one of the most successful detectives in the history of the British police. Grieve hopes that by pulling together these different techniques, he and his team will finally solve the case. First, he wants to investigate Alexander's background, to better understand the legendary king and to see if it holds any clues. In ancient Macedonia, a kingdom renowned for its military strength, Alexander was brought up as a warrior prince. Aristotle, the great philosopher, was his tutor. As a Macedonian prince, he grew up with a passion for hunting, drinking, and war. But aged just 20, he witnessed the brutal assassination of his father, Philip. Alexander was made king of Macedonia, but its borders could not contain him. With a small force, the restless young king left his homeland. His sights were set on a greater prize, the Persian Empire. Alexander pitched his Macedonian units against Persia's vast armies. And against all odds, he defeated them in battle after battle. Next to fall was Egypt, where Alexander was made a god. His engraved image in the Temple of Luxor still shows him as the first European pharaoh. Searching for the edge of the world, and still in his 20s, he drove his army east into the unknown. He crushed the warlords of Afghanistan, then stormed on to lead the attack against the Rajas of India.
Alexander led by example. He was amazingly inspiring. The men revered him, stunningly brave. The companions have to dissuade him from risking his life on a scale that you, I, everybody watching, we couldn't possibly do this. We'd be scared out of our wits. He did it every day.
Naming cities after himself wherever he went. In just over 10 years, he carved out an empire covering 2 million square miles. To John Grieve, it seems as if Alexander never knew when to stop. In the weeks before his final illness, he planned yet another ambitious campaign.
He had enormous plans for a conquest of Arabia. He was already looking westward to conquering Italy and to conquering Carthage. If he had lived, the prospects of these conquests might have changed the history of the world. And so naturally, people want to know, why did he die as young as he did?
To begin his investigation, Grieve is on the hunt for evidence. He wants to establish a precise date for Alexander's death. The British Museum in London houses thousands of clay tablets from ancient Babylon in Iraq. Dr. Irving Finkel has unearthed one that relates directly to the case.
So what does this fragment tell us about Alexander?
This fragment tells us about the death of Alexander in Babylon. It's only a fragment, but it's very important. It's part of what we call an astronomical diary. Now, the guys who wrote this, they made close observations of things in the heavens and phenomena like the height of the river and the price in the market, and they wrote these things down in chronological order.
This was the secret work of the Magi. The scientists of their day, their precise diaries combine readings from the stars with accurate records of events in Babylon. Can their chronicles help Grieve with his investigation?
So the man who wrote this says that there were clouds and the king died, that's all. And we know from the associated material that this must be dated to the reign of Alexander, therefore the king is Alexander. And by examining the bits of astronomical information, we can say that it comes out to June the 11th, 323 BC. It's tantamount to the death certificate.
So what we're looking at is a piece of evidence that was created very close to the time of Alexander's death, within days of his death.
That's exactly right.
John Grieve has his first piece of hard evidence, the date of Alexander's death. But to put together a strong case, he must now establish what the historical sources say about the events leading up to this date. Many of the sources were written years after the event and give conflicting accounts. So just as he would on a modern case, Grieve decides to call on an expert witness. Robin Lane Fox of Oxford University is one of the world's leading authorities on Alexander the Great.
It is the most disputed, immediately the most controversial death in antiquity. One set his feet.
Lane Fox explains that the ancient sources divide into two main camps. One describes Alexander as having died from a fever. The other claims he was poisoned. Detailed in the pages of a book of romantic legends about Alexander, the poison plot has always intrigued historians because it contains precise information that cannot be found anywhere else.
It names very specifically and not implausibly people who were present at Alexander's last party and divides them into those who knew and those who didn't of a plot to kill him.
The other explanation, that Alexander died from a fever, is detailed in a source known as the Royal Diaries. Claiming to give a detailed account of Alexander's last days, Lane Fox can analyze the diaries and provide Grieve with a time frame for his investigation.
From the Babylonian tablet, you can date his death to the 10th, 11th of June. If you turn to the Royal Diaries, which are themselves not above suspicion, you have a period of some 12 days between the party and the time of death. How do you fill the gap?
If he is to discover the truth about what really happened during those 12 days, Grieve must treat the historical sources with the same caution he would an unreliable witness. To test the theories, he will use the latest forensic tools available. Did Alexander die of disease, or was he poisoned? Or will Grieve's research unearth an entirely new explanation? Grieve uses historical accounts of Alexander's physical condition to construct a virtual body. The sources say that Alexander was riddled with wounds. Once in battle, a Persian sword cut his head to the bone. In India, he nearly died when he took an arrow to the chest, possibly puncturing a lung. His thigh was ripped open at the Battle of Issus. Arrows shattered a shin bone and pierced an ankle. Other physical damage was self-inflicted. Could Alexander's lifestyle have been his downfall? Grieve turns to his expert on ancient medical conditions, Robert Arnott.
He was a heavy drinker, he was a heavy partygoer, and of course, this would have had a drain on his body. It would have reduced his immunity in many respects. The heavy drinking, his liver could well have been shot to pieces. He may have had kidney problems, and he may well have been treated by his doctors for many of these symptoms.
If Alexander's body was already weakened by wounds and hard drinking, there's a chance that a fever, as described in the royal diaries, might have been fatal. But what could have caused the fever? The diaries say that Alexander was drinking heavily at a banquet at the end of May. That night, he developed a high temperature and died 12 days later. One traditional explanation has been that Alexander was struck down by malaria.
He'd been in the Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Iraq marshes only a few weeks, perhaps a month or two before, and many people think he may have caught malaria there. It was dormant in him. They had no quinine. How is he going to stop it? Can't. We can hardly stop it nowadays.
Cerebral malaria, the strain that could have killed him, has very particular symptoms. But do they match Alexander's? Grieve calls in Dr. John Marr, who has extensive experience of tropical diseases.
Cerebral malaria is where the parasites literally eat up the red blood cells, turning the blood to a thick black soup. They can develop heart failure, they can develop black water fever, which is the passage of black urine.
But the royal diaries make no mention of black urine. And there's something else which doesn't add up. Cerebral malaria causes a high temperature which then fluctuates over several days. But the diaries say that Alexander's high fever was sustained throughout his illness. For the first time, Dr. Marr believes it is possible to rule malaria out of the investigation. He analyzes Alexander's recorded symptoms again and finds a clue he believes has been missed until now. He emails John Grieve with an entirely new diagnosis. He believes Alexander could have died from West Nile fever, a disease carried by birds and mosquitoes.
I wanted to look at the larger picture surrounding Alexander's death. So I went back a few pages before he became ill and started reading Plutarch's description of his approach to the city of Babylon. There was a striking passage that others had missed.
What Dr. Marr found was the description of a sinister event, seen at the time as a bad omen for Alexander. The king was said to have seen a flock of birds pecking at each other. The birds then fell from the sky, dead.
Dead birds, they died in front of him, and this was an omen. But it also, to me, it was a clue.
Dr. Marr made the connection between this event and one that occurred over 2,300 years later. In 1999, New York City also faced an outbreak of dying birds. They were suffering from West Nile fever. Just 2 or 3 weeks later, the first human case was recorded. A mosquito-borne viral infection, West Nile fever can be caught by humans as well as birds. In humans, the virus causes an extremely high temperature, which lasts for days. This pattern exactly fits the account of Alexander's illness in the royal diaries. John Grieve is intrigued by the West Nile fever theory, but as a detective, he only wants to deal in proof.
It's a very interesting development, and it's something totally new. Got some doubts.
He knows that the fever account was written over 20 years after Alexander's death, so its reliability is questionable. Some believe it was simply a cover-up to murder.
At this stage of the investigation, you've got to keep an open mind and have a look at the other theories that have held sway for a long time, not least poison.
The theory that he's poisoned is one that's worth taking seriously. There was an awful lot of poison in the ancient world, and there were an awful lot of people who hated Alexander, feared him, were jealous of him, and would have been happy to murder him.
Grieve's sights now turn to a place where the assassination of kings was common. Alexander's homeland, Macedonia.
If you can look for a murderer, then you start off looking amongst people who know the people who've been killed, people who've got access and opportunity.
The sources tell us that the man behind the poison plot was Antipater, governor of Macedonia. He had been stripped of his powers by Alexander and feared for his life. Antipater planned to assassinate Alexander in Babylon, using one of his sons, Cassander, to fetch poison from Macedonia. Another son, Iolus, is already in Babylon, ideally placed to poison the king. A Macedonian power struggle at its most deadly. Could Alexander have been the victim of this family plot?
The Macedonian nobility is notable for its cruelty. This is a world in which feud, blood feud, murder, violence, these are all the order of the day.
And Antipater may have felt desperate, for Alexander could be ruthless.
He possibly killed more human beings in warfare than anyone else in the history of the world had done up to that date. With Alexander on the throne, you never knew how good the odds of living to the next day were. Alexander might turn on you in an instant.
Alexander could even kill good friends. One drunken argument led to murder at the point of a spear. Alexander's violence could have given someone very close to him a motive to assist in the poison plot. Aristotle, his former tutor and one of history's greatest philosophers, is said to have supplied the poison in revenge for the execution of his nephew. Within months of Alexander's death, Aristotle was publicly accused of involvement. Greaves' research confirms that Antipater's son Cassander did make the 1,500-mile journey from Macedonia to Babylon just before Alexander's death. What's more, Greaves learns that all was not well at Alexander's army headquarters. And Alexander was becoming an increasingly remote, godlike figure.
Alexander might have called himself the Great King, the King of Kings in the style of the Persian monarchs, but to his men he was simply Alexander the Macedonian, the son of Philip. They did not enjoy his grandiosity. They did not enjoy his unending desire to continue marching to the ends of the world in conquest.
And now Alexander was determined to invade Arabia and its hostile deserts. Only a year before, 60,000 men, women, and children had died in a similar expedition. Greaves suspects that fear of a repeat disaster caused serious unrest in the army.
Is that going to Arabia that he had planned just one step too far for those who'd already felt that they'd gone to the end of the world with him? If you get the right set of circumstances and the right triggers, then loyalties and allegiances change. Even the closest relationships can change.
Greaves sees how resentment and distrust among the military commanders in Babylon could have given Cassander confidence as he planned the murder. It is said that his first step was to make contact with his younger brother, Iollas. As a detective, what interests Greaves is that the family had both a motive to kill Alexander and direct access to him. The records claim that Iollas was the man who actually killed Alexander. As his cupbearer, responsible for pouring the wine at banquets, Iollas was ideally placed to administer the poison to Alexander's own cup. But what actually happened that night? Greaves uses the records of the plot to recreate the crime scene. At the end of May 323 BC, Alexander was invited to what would become his final banquet. Greaves has learned that several guests were in on the plot, including his admiral of the fleet, the host of the banquet, and even his personal doctor. The conspirators divert Alexander's attention while Iollas pours the poison into a massive ceremonial cup to be used only by Alexander. Unaware of any threat, Alexander drains the cup in one. First, it is said he just seemed drunk. But about half an hour after he drank the toast, he began suffering intense pain. Some say he cried out as if struck by an arrow in the liver. The 12-day countdown to his death had begun. John Greaves feels he has established both motive and opportunity to support the claims of the poison plot. But he still wants proof. Dr. Leo Shep is a specialist from the world-renowned Poisons Institute in New Zealand. He'll be using the latest medical simulation techniques to help test the possible effects of poison during the final days of Alexander's life.
He took the wine on board and he became unwell within half an hour. And when I read that, it made me quite excited, and it suggested to me that we may have a poison.
Dr. Shep needs to find a poison known to the ancient Greeks that could have caused Alexander's reported symptoms: sharp pain after half an hour, vomiting, difficulty in talking, and increasing weakness.
There were about probably 25, 26 poisons, toxins that I looked at, and discounted all but 2 or 3 of them.
After painstaking research, Dr. Shep thinks he has identified a poison that could fit this time frame. A plant called white hellebore, which grew widely in Alexander's homeland.
Quite distinct. You've got these veins running through the leaves. It's a perennial plant. It can go up to 0.5.
But it's the harmless-looking root that contains the poison. Grieve asks Dr. Shep and his toxicology team to analyze a sample of hellebore root. He wants to discover if it contains toxins which could cause Alexander's fatal symptoms. Could this be the evidence they need?
The final moment of truth.
Yeah, moment of truth.
We'll put it on the machine. So Leo, this is it. It's finished.
Okay.
Have the tests revealed the root's deadly secrets? It looks positive. The peaks on the graph match up with readings of known toxins.
The significance of finding these peaks is that we've got these principal toxins present. This root is potent. This root is a nasty fellow which can cause serious toxicity.
After this initial breakthrough, Dr. Shep searches modern medical cases to establish exactly how hellebore affects the body. He discovers an incident of hellebore poisoning in the Korean War in the 1950s. Soldiers became seriously ill after hellebore plants were accidentally included in their vegetable soup.
What we found was very interesting regarding some soldiers in the Korean War. 14 soldiers were given a soup that was accidentally spiked with hellebore. Within half an hour, they came down with symptoms that were similar to what we see with Alexander the Great.
The records show that hellebore's most dangerous effect is to slow down the heart rate. This can be fatal.
By the time the doctors saw the soldiers, they were weak, their pulse was very weak, they were lethargic, they were vomiting, they can't respond to outward stimuli, the extremities are cold. We're dealing with soldiers who are experienced to harsh conditions, smitten by this plant. And we see the similarity with Alexander the Great.
In hellebore, Grieve finally has a poison that matches Alexander's symptoms. But can it fit the 12-day time frame for his death? To find out, they travel to a state-of-the-art simulation unit in London, where Dr. Shep and his medical team plan to use a computer-controlled dummy body.
And even his blood pressure is not really coming up.
Its blood pressure, breathing, and pulse rate fluctuate to show the effect of hellebore at key stages over the 12 days leading to death. The poison plot suggests that Alexander may have been given several doses, so Dr. Shep works out a series of steps, starting with a first dose at the banquet.
My reading of the texts suggests that he took on board the wine of that night when he's carousing with his officers. Liquids rapidly absorbed from the stomach, taken up in the body, the heart rate starts dropping, the blood pressure starts dropping. We start to see it now, there's a drop in heart rate. They have difficulty breathing. At that state, they become very weak.
If you notice his breathing, if you put your hand on his chest, you can sort of feel he's barely breathing, extremely slow. You can even see that the heart rhythm itself is very abnormal, so you're getting abnormal beats.
Yes.
So the poison is actually affecting the way the heart beats.
But this first dose, given at the banquet, may not have been enough to kill Alexander.
The trouble is, within a day or so, the hellebore could start to be eliminated from the body.
Segments there indicating so.
It's clear to Grieve that a second dose was required, and the account of the poison plot suggests how it might have been given. Alexander had asked for his throat to be tickled with a feather to help him vomit, common medical practice for the day.
They possibly, with the tickling of the throat, introduced more of the poison. Now, we know 1 gram of powder is enough to kill somebody. The body is weak, the elimination processes are compromised.
When this second dose is simulated, the dummy's vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing deteriorate steadily.
He was in no state to be able to get up and walk.
Absolutely. He's almost about to go into a cardiac arrest now.
In the simulation, the body responds to the third dose with a fatal collapse.
And beating at a random manner. This man is almost about to die really now. And
There he goes.
that's it.
I find it utterly inconceivable, and I would need an awful lot of evidence before I started putting Aristotle a suspect here of any kind. Sounds like killing your own son, almost.
As he closes in on the truth, Greaves' experience of modern poison cases prompts him to look at this ancient one from a totally different perspective. He must now re-examine whether the death of Alexander was even murder. From the evidence assembled, John Greaves sifts out the strongest clues. First, he's convinced that the 12-day time frame for Alexander's sickness is believable. It's supported by both main sources, and it would be unlikely that anyone would fabricate such a prolonged decline. Greaves also believes his poison team have come up with a potential cause of death: hellebore. The simulation showed that it could have killed Alexander over 12 days.
This is the ischemic beats. So, 69.
But there is one fact which increases Greaves' distrust of the plot theory. Poison was not the favored weapon of the Macedonians.
I don't think that poison was part of the macho Macedonian tradition. If somebody was going to kill Alexander, he would have been struck down with a sword.
If he wasn't murdered, the other traditional view is that he became sick, continued drinking, and then collapsed into his fatal decline. But there is something missing from the accounts that has always bothered Greaves. Neither version of Alexander's death details his medical care during those last days.
There's lots of bits missing from this jigsaw puzzle, but one of the bits that's missing is where are the doctors, because they appear in other parts of the account of Alexander's campaigns.
As Greaves explores the practices of doctors in the ancient world, he makes a startling discovery. Hellebore, the poison which allegedly killed Alexander, was also used in small doses as a medicine.
Hellebore purges the body. It cleans you out. And purgatives, in the understanding of the period, the changing of the humours within the body, was what medicine was all about. And hellebore would have been right up there at the top as one of the medicines they would have used. But of course, in large amounts, it's a poison.
Greaves now searches for any evidence that Alexander might have been taking hellebore as a medicine.
We have to remember that he may have been young, but that he had pushed his body beyond the breaking point for many years. In particular, he'd suffered a grievous wound in the retreat from India, and he could not have been in the healthiest of shape.
But Greaves' research has uncovered something intriguing. Hellebore was not only used to treat physical illness, but emotional trauma too. Re-examining the historical sources, Greaves searches for another reason why Alexander may have been prescribed hellebore. Eventually, he finds one. He was more than Alexander's leading general. He was his emotional prop. Alexander once declared, "Hephaestion loves me for myself, not as the king." When Hephaestion fell sick and died, Alexander was so devastated that he ordered the building of a 5-story funeral pyre. To establish the effect of this traumatic loss on Alexander, former Commander Greaves consults top forensic psychiatrist Dr. Harold Burstein.
Once that loss occurred, once Alexander was beset by grief, his loss would have left Alexander with a burning rage, a grief which knew no bounds. It's likely that he would have then not as able to protect himself, not as able to use his best judgment. He would have drank more, all of which would have made him more vulnerable for any interpersonal problems which may arise.
Dr. Burstein explains to Grieve that Alexander's immune system and behavior could have been seriously affected, perhaps causing his doctor to treat him.
One potential form of treatment for mood swings, for post-traumatic stress disorder, could be hellebore.
A piece of the puzzle suddenly falls into place. It prompts Grieve to reach an entirely new conclusion. Could Alexander have died of an overdose of medicinal hellebore?
The crux of this may lie in that he may have been poisoned, but he may not necessarily have been poisoned directly. He may not have been poisoned intentionally. He may have been poisoned as part of his therapy.
To determine the likelihood of this accidental overdose theory, Grieve asks his toxicologist, Dr. Shep, to assess the dosage used by the ancient doctors.
Here we've got some examples of how the ancients prepared the hellebore for therapeutic doses. Now I did some quick calculations and worked out how much hellebore would be in these doses.
His research shows that to encourage vomiting and purge the body, patients were regularly given toxic doses. And Dr. Shep discovers concrete proof about the risks of taking hellebore. In the 1950s, doctors tried to use it to reduce high blood pressure. But its toxic effects proved just as dangerous as they had 2,300 years earlier.
What was intriguing about it was that it didn't stay long on the market because the doctors were concerned that the window or the border between what was therapeutic for treating the symptoms and what was toxic was too narrow.
If Alexander the Great was taking more and more hellebore in an attempt to restore his health, accidental death becomes a real possibility.
He was a young man still in a hurry. You know, it's like even today, I want to be out of hospital now. I want to be discharged today because I've got so-and-so to do. I think Alexander the Great died of a combination of himself together with what the doctors were pumping into him, and towards the end, they got it wrong.
Grieve considers the possibility that Alexander, desperate to invade Arabia, ordered his doctors to up his dosage of hellebore, unknowingly taking risks with this dangerous medicine.
Terrible thing though it might be, maybe Alexander was so impatient to get well that he overdosed. He wants to get better, he wants to go to Arabia, and the dosage is wrong.
After a year of investigation, former Commander John Grieve believes that modern forensic and medical techniques have finally allowed us to dissect the myths surrounding the mysterious death of Alexander the Great. A man who in just 10 years became one of the greatest empire builders of all time. A man whose legacy still lives on today. Had he lived, we can only imagine how he would have changed the history of our world.